talking about this being a post-Shavuos year, talking about the 10 pronouncements at Sinai. I want to offer you some observations, some of which are quite fundamental. First of all, I tried to be consistent in calling them 10 pronouncements. There are two reasons for that. There are no 10 commandments. It's just not true. If you look carefully at the text, there may be 15 or 16, depending upon how you count. So the term 10 commandments, Cecil B. DeMille, notwithstanding, is totally inaccurate. For whatever reasons, the Christians called it that way. The Blue Book here, which is communicating to Jews who've never heard of Judaism, uses that term, but it has no source in our literature. In the Torah itself, the text is referred to as Aseres HaDevorim, which means 10 statements. In rabbinic literature, it's Aseres HaDibros, which means 10 pronouncements. Nowhere is it identified as having 10 mitzvos. As I said, because that's simply false. Now, these 10 pronouncements form an extremely fundamental part of the Torah. So fundamental that there was a time, Mishnah records this, when it was a practice to recite them every day. That was discontinued because people reciting it every day came to the impression that only the 10 pronouncements come from God. All the rest are somehow made up by the rabbis. And that's a disaster. Because, in fact, the whole of the Chumash comes from God. That's when they discontinued reciting it every day. But that doesn't mean that they were demoted. They do form an extremely fundamental part of Jewish thinking. One is because of the form that the revelation took, and the second is because of their content. Let me start with the form, because it is fundamental and it carries its own independent message. Take the blue books. What I'm doing now is telling you what's in Maimonides' Fundamentals of the Torah, chapters 7 and 8. Basically, chapter 8. Take a look at page 403. Here, the Jewish people is at the base of the Sinai mountain, and this is just the briefest prelude to the Revelation of Sinai. Verse 9. Hashem said to Moses, "Behold, I come to you in the thickness of the cloud, so that the people will hear as I speak to you, and they will also believe in you forever." There's a lot packed into that statement. There's a lot packed into every statement in the Torah, but here it's a little more on the surface. I, says God, am going to create a unique event in history. I'm going to speak to you, you're a prophet, but I'm going to allow the entire nation hear me speaking to you. Why am I going to do that? Because if I do that, then they'll believe in you forever. Implication, if I don't do that, they won't believe in you forever. That's why I'm doing it. Says Maimonides, why do we believe that Moses was a prophet and that he communicated to us what God told him? Why do we believe that? Is it because he did miracles? Said Maimonides, no. Miracles cannot be a proof that God speaks to a person in the first place. So he does miracles. So what? All that means is that God either favors him with special powers, or when he wants that something should happen, God performs it. It doesn't imply that God speaks to him. The two concepts are not related logically. And if your only trust in Moses, let's say, was on the basis of miracles that he did, it would always be possible for a later prophet to come and also do miracles, maybe even more spectacular miracles. And then you would have every reason to trade what Moses told you for the later prophet. Couldn't be a prediction you'll believe in it forever. No. The basis of Moses' credibility is not that he did miracles. That could be temporary, but it wouldn't be absolute and it wouldn't be forever. So the basis of Moses' credibility is that we ourselves heard God speaking to Moses. Now, imagine a later prophet who arises and says, I'm a prophet from God, look, I'll do these and these miracles. And God says Q. And we know that Q contradicts what Moses says. At that point, we're going to say, I don't know. I don't know how to explain the fact that you did what you did, but we ourselves heard God telling this to Moses and heard Moses telling it to us. So we know by our own testimony, our own experience, our own observation that God spoke to Moses, told him these things. You? So you did some tricks that we can't explain. So what? That doesn't imply that God spoke to you at all, or that you're transmitting what God spoke to you. That's why Maimonides says this is the basis of Moses' credibility. And indeed, it's the basis of credibility in prophecy altogether. Now, that being the case, and Maimonides says if somebody does a miracle, that does not prove that he's a prophet. Why then do we trust any later prophets? Did we hear God speaking to Isaiah? Did we hear God speaking to Jeremiah, to Ezekiel, to Amos, to Joshua, to any of the later prophets? The answer is no, we did not. So why do we accept them as prophets? Maimonides has a radical idea here. He says the only reason we trust that anyone else is a prophet is because Moses said to trust him. Just like Moses, speaking in God's name, told us to put on tefillin, to keep kosher, give charity. Moses said, speaking in God's name, that under certain conditions, we should treat a person as a prophet. If he's a righteous person, and he's a scholar, and he does miracles, and he claims that God speaks to him, he tells us what God told him. Under those conditions, says Moses, listen very carefully, treat him as a prophet. Treat him as a prophet. That's a law. That's how I should behave. Asks Maimonides, do I know that he's a prophet? Says Maimonides, no. You don't know that he's a prophet. Any more than judges, where witnesses come and they say, we saw XYZ happen. Ask Maimonides, when kosher witnesses who survive cross-examination tell the judge, we saw XYZ happen, does the judge know that XYZ happened? So Maimonides, no, he does not know that. All he knows is there's a law. The law says when people come and give you testimony and they survive cross-examination, then decide the case on the basis of their statement. That's what you're supposed to do. But you don't know that the events took place. So we don't know that Isaiah was a prophet. What we know is Moses told us to treat him as a prophet. And what Moses says is binding. That's what Maimonides says. This means that the way in which we came to experience Moses as a prophet becomes the source of all prophecy thereafter. Without Moses as a basis, there would be no other prophecy. Now, let's replay the scenario that I mentioned briefly before, and I'll fill in a couple of pertinent details and see how it comes out. So-and-so says, I'm a prophet. I come from God. I have things to tell you. Now, let's imagine that he fulfilled the other criteria in the case that I'm subtly referring to wasn't true, but let's say he did. And the people say, well, one of the things that Moses told us to do was see whether you could do something special. He says, oh, special? Come with me to the park. Come with me to the park. Watch while I take a stroll on the lake. I'm just making this up, just randomly. Watch while I take a stroll on the lake. Okay, let's see. And he strides out into the water, and he walks on the surface of the water. And we say to him, okay, Dad, we're listening. What have you got to say? And he says, first thing I want to tell you is, not everything Moses told you is reliable. Not everything Moses told you is up to date. Things have changed since then. Not everything Moses told you is applicable. How are people going to respond? What are they going to say? What thought process is going to go through their minds? What they're going to say is, listen, Dad, we're listening to you. You have a potential to have our ear because Moses told us to do that. The fact that you strolled on the lake isn't interesting to us. That doesn't imply anything to us. The fact that you do miracles says nothing about whether you're a prophet or not. We're not interested. Moses said when a person meets certain conditions, Treat him as a prophet. Treat him as a prophet. You now are telling us that not everything Moses says is reliable, applicable, up to date, and all the rest. You just undercut your own authority. The only reason I haven't listening to you is because I'm trusting Moses. You tell me I can't trust Moses? Then you have contradicted your own authority to give a message. And you're out. That's one of the reasons that Christianity was so dreadfully unsuccessful in preaching to Jews. Because you couldn't preach to a Jew in the name of God, whether you called yourself God or not, when we ourselves heard Moses' prophecy, we heard God speak to Moses, and therefore we know from our own experience that Moses is a prophet, and anybody else's prophecy is valid only because Moses said to treat him as a prophet, and you now are telling us that Moses is not reliable, then I have no reason to listen to you whatsoever. That's one of the reasons that the early Christians were very unsuccessful in influencing Jews. So the way in which this prophecy at Sinai came to Moses and to the Jewish people is absolutely crucial for the credibility of the Torah forever. Are we together so far? I just want to tell you something. Maybe someday you'll have an opportunity to study in detail. Where the text says here that we read, and they'll believe in you forever, I just translated it the way Ibn Ezra translates it. Forever means in succeeding generations, no one will come. You will be believed in. There'll always be individuals who do things that are not mentally normal and balanced and sane. But believe in you will continue forever. What about the rest of Moses' lifetime? Students sometimes raise this question. Okay, there was a revelation at Sinai, and we heard God speaking to Moses, and God, and we know therefore Moses is a genuine prophet. But after that, a gigantic amount of information came just from Moses. After that, we didn't hear God speak. How do we know that at some future time, Moses didn't make up some things on his own? How do we know that he didn't invent or subtract things on his own? How do we know that didn't happen? Now, I think there are two answers to this question. One that I usually give, and then one that Maimonides gives. You can bet which one I think is superior. Right? But I want to show you mine as a kind of playoff to what Maimonides says. Look on page 971. This is the end of the repetition of the Ten Commandments in Sefer Dvarim, in Deuteronomy. We'll start with verse 19. These words Hashem spoke to your entire congregation on the mountain, in the midst of the fire, cloud, and the thick cloud, a great voice never repeated. And he inscribed them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. By the way, I have heard people ask, somehow, somewhere, there's a false impression that the people heard nothing. They heard nothing. Everything came from Moses. Moses went up to the mountain, came down with everything. There are at least 6 places where the Torah is against that explicitly, and this is one of them. These words Hashem spoke to your entire congregation on the mountain. So you simply cannot say that they didn't hear anything on their own. It says so word for word here. It happened that when you heard the voice in the midst of the darkness, the mountain was burning with fire, that all the heads of your tribes, your elders, approached me. Okay, they've been through it, now they come to Moses, and they say the following. They said, behold, Hashem our God has shown us his glory, his greatness, and we've heard his voice in the midst of the fire. This day we saw that Hashem will speak to a person and he can live. Second time. So he spoke to them. But now, why should we die when this great fire consumes us? If we continue to hear the voice of Hashem our God any longer, we will die. Now, you may wonder, aren't you contradicting yourself? You just pointed out that you heard God speak and you lived. And now you're saying, we hear him speak again, we're going to die. We just saw that a person can hear God speak and live. You can have an experience where you survive, but you know very well that you survived by, what they say, the skin of your teeth, and that if it happened again, you would almost certainly fail. So you can have the experience of surviving, but know that the survival was so precarious, so thin, that you're quite certain that if it happened again, you would certainly lose. So that's their fear. Their fear is that if we have to go through this again, we're going to die. 23 at the bottom of the page. For is there any human that has heard the voice of God, living God, speaking from the midst of the fire as we haven't lived? No one's ever had before. We did it. We just barely made it. We're afraid we're never going to make it again. You should approach and hear whatever Hashem, our God, will say, and you should speak to us whatever Hashem, our God, will speak to you. Then we shall hear, we shall do. The people are appointing Moses the intermediary. It's their idea. Now, I suggest to you that the following scenario is very, very questionable. The people hear God speak. They say to Moses, we can't take this anymore. Please, you be the intermediary. You hear it from God and bring it to us. 3 years go by, Moses is giving lectures. And then when Moses says, no cheeseburgers, no cheeseburgers, you made that up. You made that up. You invented that. You want to drive McDonald's out of business. Excuse me. You put him in there. You voted him in. He didn't ask for this. God didn't dictate this. You put him in there. And now you don't trust him? That doesn't sound honest. That doesn't sound honest. You had problems. You had a worry. Then you should have gone through it the whole time with yourselves. So I think that this is a very weak position for the Jewish people to be in, to say, later Moses lost it and so forth and so on. If Moses was the kind of person who could lose it, you shouldn't have trusted him to be the intermediary. Maimonides has a very striking approach here, and I must tell you, I don't think of this at all. If I had read Maimonides for 1,000 years, I never would have thought of it. But the Meshech Chochmah, the man who's the author of the name of this yeshiva, the Osameach, Meshech Chochmah is a sefer that he wrote on Chumash. An unbelievably sophisticated sefer, quoting from the Guide of the Perplexed and the Zohar and everywhere else. He was a gigantic genius. He knew all over. In his introduction to the book of Exodus, which in the Hebrew is only a few pages, 4 or 5 pages, he says, when it says they'll believe in you forever, it means for the whole of your life. And since anyone who has free will, you can't make such a statement about. And now the student says, oh, I was right. I was right. What do you mean? How can you predict that you can trust him forever if he has free will? Anyone with free will can turn around. Anyone with free will can fail. Says the Meshech Chochmah, Moses lost his free will. That's why the Torah says you believe in him forever, because he lost his free will. And if you look carefully, Maimonides, this requires some careful reading, which again I didn't accomplish, but Meshech Chochmah points it out, and Rabbi Meiselman, who taught me this, points out, it's quite clear because Maimonides says, among other things, that Moses became like an angel. Became like an angel, who doesn't have free will. So, says Meshech Chochmah, explaining Maimonides, that's why it can be guaranteed that you believe in him. Because you know that from the revelation on, he didn't have free will. That's the guarantee. That means the transmission is pure. Now, Rabbi Maslow and I both recognized when we read this that after the revelation at Sinai, Moses makes mistakes. He does fail. There are several things he does wrong. The Meshech Chochmah doesn't address that, so I don't know exactly what he means. We thought perhaps it means he didn't have free will with respect to transmitting the Torah, whereas with respect to other things he might have had free will. We didn't come to any agreed understanding of that problem. But that's what the Meshech Chochmah says, and the Rambam says it as well. He became like an angel. He retained in the state of being of the revelation, and when you have revelation, then like that, then you don't have free will. So that being the case, this revelation at Sinai becomes the source for all, the authority of all prophecy, and it becomes what happened to Moses in the continuous state that he was in becomes the authority for the reliability of the Torah altogether. Okay, are we together? Okay, now, in the content, there are those who use the 10 commandments, the 10 pronouncements, can sin against my own rule. The 10 pronouncements as an encapsulated form of the 630 commandments. Apparently, Rasad Yagon wrote a liturgical poem for Shavuos, which we have lost, in which he actually classified all 613 commandments under the rubric of the 10 pronouncements of Sinai. And then those are reduced to the first two. The first is, I am Hashem your God, whether it's belief or knowledge or whatever. We'll talk about that in Yis Hashem. And the second is not to have false gods. In a certain sense, they're encapsulated in those as well. So these 10 are really extremely fundamental. Also, the commentators divide the 10 into 5 governing our relationship with God and 5 governing our relationship with other people. Splits up first 5 and second 5. Now that split needs a little bit of explanation. The first 5, you have God's existence and not serving other gods, worshiping idols, not taking God's name in vain in an oath, Shabbos. Those sound okay. They're governing our relationship with God. The 5th is honoring your parents. Honoring your parents is not obviously governing your relationship to God. Honoring your parents sounds like it's your relationship to other people, particularly your parents. Why would that go on the man-God side of the division? But one explanation is this. Why is there an obligation to honor your parents? Easy. God told us to. Okay. Why did he tell us to? What is there in the parent-child relationship that would, so to speak, give God an interest in our having special responsibilities to our parents? You want to say?
There's a sense where if you can't sort of have honour for your parents who looked after you from birth and have raised you and sacrificed for you, then how are you going to have a bigger awareness of Hashem who created the world for you? You know, if you can't see it from that small scale of honouring your parents, you're not going to be able to comprehend that Hashem created the world for you.
Okay, let me say it over for the recording, which I never remember to do, and I'm just refuting that at the moment. So you're really talking about the idea of gratitude. If you can't have gratitude for your parents, given all that they do for you,
it's more than gratitude. That's the basic. I'm talking on gratitude, but then it's that awareness that that everything that you have is ultimately because of them. So it's more than just gratitude. Oh, like thank you. It's more like if it wasn't for them, your existence wouldn't be here.
Okay, well, maybe there are 2 ideas there, and maybe that's going to help out with the problem I'm going to raise. But let's start with gratitude. You say it's more than gratitude. You are agreeing that there is gratitude there. Normally, a child owes an enormous debt of gratitude to his parents because his parents provide him with an enormous amount of benefit. What happens in the case where it's not so? Let's suppose the conception took place through a failure of contraception, which happens. And the parents would have cheerfully had an abortion, but they didn't discover it till the 5th month. And then they were afraid to have an abortion. And immediately after the birth, the parents abandoned the baby with no thought to the baby's safety. And the baby is picked up and raised, and someday discovers who the parents are. Hard to see there an obligation of gratitude. Bringing him into existence was an accident. They would have prevented it if they could. And afterwards they gave him nothing. Hard to see it as a matter of gratitude. Or, in even more horrible cases, where the parents victimize the child. Cause the child psychological damage, physical damage. Hard to see there's any obligation of gratitude in a case like that. Is there still a mitzvah of honoring your parents when there's no debt of gratitude? Then the parents treated the child criminally, violating the Torah's laws and treating the child. Is there any debt? Is there any obligation of honoring the parents? There's a difference of opinion about it. Let's consider the opinion that says yes. You still have to honor your parents. Why would that be? And the answer now touches on the second thing that you said. But I would say, just pushing it a little further, they are the reason why you exist. Okay, but now, our existence ultimately isn't just a happenstance. It isn't just an accident. It means that the Creator used them to bring you into existence. They were the means that he chose to bring you into existence. Then they are, so to speak, the locus of his activity in bringing you into existence. And that deserves honor. That deserves respect. Because of Hashem's involvement there, it deserves honor and respect. This is the extension of an idea which I sort of knew about because I knew the sources, but I didn't focus on it until I read it. An essay by Chaim Shmulevitz, whose essays on the Parshios are translated in English, and I recommend them to you. They are very well written, very clearly focused, very scholarly. Everything he says based on a source. I would say very original in a certain respect, and they have a very great advantage that they're very short. And he has an essay there on what he calls Hakar Satov, which is normally translated as gratitude, and he brings examples of this sort which are extreme, or very extreme. The Talmud tells a story about a man who was bitten by an arod. A arod is some sort of poisonous creature, whether it's a reptile of some kind or a spider of some kind, and very poisonous. Now the only thing to do if you're bitten by an arod is to run to a body of water and bathe yourself. So this guy is bitten by the arod, he runs to a body of water and wades out to bathe himself, and what does he observe but a person drowning? So he goes and saves the person's life, and when the person starts to thank him, he says, "Don't thank me, thank the arod. Because it's because the arod bit me that I came to wash, and that's how I found you and saved you." Another example, Moses, after killing the Egyptian in Egypt, runs for his life, and he comes to Midian, and he saves the daughters of Yisro from the local shepherds, and when they want to thank him, he says, "Don't thank me, thank the Egyptian who was beating the Jew, whom I killed, which then caused Pharaoh to try to kill me, and I escaped, and I ended up here. Thank the Egyptian." I don't think that drowning fellow in the Talmudic story owes a debt of gratitude to the arod. I don't think that the daughters of Yisro owe a debt of gratitude to that Egyptian whom Moses killed. Gratitude doesn't apply. But it is this idea of tracing back the circumstances and taking account of every element that God used in bringing about this result. That drowning fellow is saved because God caused the arod to bite this guy, and then this guy went to wash and saved his life. So the arod is in the chain of events, and you can see God's presence in that arod leading to the chain of events. So I think really it's using that chain of events to trace it back to God. The same is true with Moses when he says to the Egyptian, the Midianite girls, that Egyptian was in the chain of events. And of course, that Egyptian beating the Jew, and beating the Jew as I came out of the palace to see my brethren the Jews and take care of them. So that was how God manipulated this salvation for you. Similarly, when it happens that parents treat a child in such a way that he has no debt of gratitude, those who say there's still an obligation of honoring those parents is because God used them. God used them in his chain of circumstances to bring this child into existence, and his honoring them is a way of showing honor to God who used them as those tools. That's why it belongs on the man-God side of the ledger, because it's really between man and God. It's not between the child and his parents. Are we together? Okay, now the same thing is true on the other side. The 10th of the commandments, which are supposed to be between man and man. The 10th is don't envy, desire things that belong to your neighbor. It's not supposed to envy or desire things that belong to my neighbor. Let's see. I'm driving in one of the suburbs of Johannesburg, which I have done several times. Yeah, great mansions there. At least they were when I was there last. Great mansions with high walls, with barbed wire and armed response, and people sitting outside with submachine guns, Okay, but inside it's quite fancy. I'm looking to buy winter resort so I can get out of the freezing northern climes, which are buried under ice and snow because of global warming, and to go to the southern hemisphere and enjoy January and February there. So I see one of these estates that's really enchanting. I go up to the door and knock on the door of the owner, and I say, I'm looking for a place, and I'm a rich American, and you're a poor South African, so you have nothing. I have everything. Can I offer you, $15? All right, $25,000. They're not worth much because nobody wants to live there. $100,000. Can I offer you? Am I violating a biblical commandment? Biblical commandment. Am I violating the prohibition against desiring something that belongs to somebody else? Golly, I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. I didn't think what I was doing was a crime, vicious, somehow immoral. Now let's take it a step further. Suppose the South African wants to sell his estate, and he puts outside a for sale sign. Is he tripping me up in violating a biblical commandment? He's going to cause me to desire his estate, and that way cause me to violate. Is the whole of commerce somehow viciously criminal? Put out for sale signs for mugs. Doesn't that cause you to want the mug? And this sounds a little extreme. Right? So there are those who say, of course you can desire what other people have. You only violate this commandment if you make plans to get it and start to put those plans into action in some illicit way. So, hanging over this fellow's fireplace is an original Dali. Painting by Salvador Dali. And I'm a Dali fan. So I offer him $237 million for this painting. He says, this painting's not for sale. I love this painting. Besides, I inherited it from my grandfather. It's not going anywhere. I said, oh boy. $237 million. You said no? Watch what's going to happen to you. I'm going to get that painting. Either I get earth-moving equipment and I hire a couple of guys from Hamas to teach me how to dig a really good tunnel, right? Invisible to the authorities on above, and I'll come tunnel under his living room floor and dig it out. Or I will investigate where he has his assets from, and I'll cause that company to go bankrupt, and I'll cause that estate to burn down, and so on and so on. I'll fix him to the point where he's got to give it to me. Then, if I do that, I retroactively violate the prohibition against desiring somebody else's object also. I violate both of them when I take action to try to get it. Action to try to get it illicitly. So that then becomes interpersonal. Because now I've taken action to hurt him. So it's not just between me and God. And that's how it can be restored, the balance. That one's also between man and man. You have a question?
Yeah. Where did he learn that? That it has to be like a duty thing to do these things. I mean, because you could learn out, but it's still like having these like worldly desires or whatever. Like, that's not the echo of how we should live.
I hear in your question that as you formulated it, you began to feel maybe it was going a little too far, and that's why you used the vocabulary at the end that isn't the ideal of how we should be living. Maybe it's not the ideal. That's not the same thing as prohibiting each and every case, absolutely. That doesn't tell me it's not an ideal. That tells me it's always absolutely wrong. Now, sachmod in Hebrew is just, I really would like to have it. I really want it. Perfectly honest people can feel that way. So, to prohibit that across the board as one of the 10 pronouncements at Sinai, if the person is completely committed to only acting in legal ways, is a little extreme, and it will infringe on normal business behavior. We do have a principle of logic which helps us interpret verses. We don't just, I'm now sort of trying to read your mind a little bit, but if you don't have this in mind, many people do. Many people have the feeling, the Torah told me to do it. Who am I to make evaluations? Who am I to use logic? God is infinite. I'm only finite. I can't decide what the Torah means. My job is just to follow. Just follow. Turn your mind off and follow. But it's not correct. It's interestingly not correct. Let me give you a very dramatic example. The Torah says the following words. If one person's ox gores another person's ox and the second one dies, and the first ox doesn't have a history of violence, here's what you do. You sell the live ox, and you sell the corpse of the dead ox, and the two people split the money. What does that mean? What's that for? Well, let's start with an assumption. Let's assume that alive, the two oxen were of equal value. $2,000 each. Let's assume that the corpse of the dead ox is worth $200. So if you sell the two of them, you get $2,200, right? $2,200. Split it, each one gets $1,100, right? What's $1,100? Well, now let's figure out. The guy whose ox died, what was his total loss? Think carefully now. The loss is $1,800 because he had a live ox worth $2,000 and now he's a dead ox worth $200. Okay? Now, he ends up with $1,100. How much is he being compensated by the other guy? His loss was $1,800 because he had possession of the corpse, which was worth $200. At the end of dividing the money, he ends up with $1,100. So how much is he being compensated by the other guy? $900. He had $200 of his own. If he ends up with $1,100, he's being compensated $900. His original loss was $1,800, and he's being compensated $900. That's where we learned the law of Chatzi Nezek, that someone who causes damage to somebody else pays half of the damage. If the animal causes the damage, and the animal is not known to be violent, so he had no direct obligation. Okay, I'm skipping Chatzi Nezek Knasa and Chatzi Nezek Mamona. He had no obligation to guard the animal. That being the case, he gets paid half damages. Are we together so far? But we made an assumption. We made an assumption that the two live oxen are worth the same amount. What if they aren't worth the same amount? Let's try an extreme example. Suppose the goring, remaining alive ox is worth $2,000, and suppose the dying ox is worth $200 when it gets hit, and the corpse is worth $100. So then, when you sell the live and the dead, you're going to get $2,100. When you split it between them, it's going to be $1,050 each. This guy had a live ox of $200 and now ends up with $1,050. Why is that? Why is that? Going to make a gigantic profit on the fact that his ox died. Is that reasonable? Now do it the other way. The goring ox is worth $2,000, and the dead ox is worth $5,000. Okay, so now, and let's say the corpse is worth $500. So the loss of the victim is $4,500. Right? Now they sell $500 and $2,000, $2,500, and they split, and he ends up with $1,250 with a loss of $4,500. Is that reasonable? Now here, the super pious tunnel vision personality says, is it fair? Is it good? Is it right? Who's talking? Just human beings. You can't use your concepts to judge God. You can't use your criteria to judge God. God said so. Follow God blindly to the ends of the earth. But that's not the halacha. That's not the halacha. The halacha is, the verse is only talking about oxen of equal value, and therefore the verse is telling you only the law of half damages, and the law is half damages no matter what the values of the oxen are. Ultimately, the law is half damages. That means that you won't carry out the verses. You won't do what the verses say. If the values of the live oxen are not equal, then you will not carry out what the verse says. You will only pay half nezek. Why? Because it's just obviously wrong to do it that way. And Tosfos says there's no hint to making this assumption in the verses whatsoever. No hint in the words that is talking about oxen on equal value. Just, it's not logical. Now, you could ask, well then how do you know where to use your logic and how do you know where not? That's a very good question. And I don't have a handy criterion for telling you. I just tell you there are many cases where the Torah is interpreted using logic. And not only that, but there are sometimes differences of opinion about it. Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam disagree in one case about whether you should use logic to interpret the verse or not. But it is definitely a criterion. Of course, if the Torah will explicitly contradict your logical assumption, then you have to give it up. But beyond that, when you use it and when you don't is a very subtle matter, but you don't simply just disregard logic. You don't simply turn your back on logic. That's not what the Torah does. Sometimes logic is overridden, but you don't just simply disregard it on the grounds that you have to be. So here also, if normal human economics depends upon people wanting what other people have and then making offers and competitive sales and so on and so on, the Torah is not going to prohibit that. That can be just an obvious observation. And that being the case, now having said all of that, I only have a few minutes. Let me handle a case for you which might seem to contradict what I'm saying, and then we'll finish for tonight. You know, probably all of you know, that if you lend money to a Jew, you can't collect interest. Lend money to a non-Jew, you can. Some think that's even recommended. But you can't collect money, you can't collect interest from a Jew. Why is that? I want you to know that in the Middle Ages, Christians took on this idea also of not lending money and collecting interest. And therefore, if they needed a loan, Christians were very unwilling to lend their money. Because you lend your money, you lose the use of it, and you gain nothing from it. And they came to Jews to get loans. So there was this kind of terrible hate inferiority complex where you have to come to the hated Jew to borrow his money because you can't get any money from a Christian, and the Jew is viciously criminal by taking interest, but of course you have to pay him the interest because that's the way it was painted in the Middle Ages. Now, let me ask you a question. Is there anything immoral about taking interest on a loan? Anything criminal, somehow insensitive, less than fully honest about taking interest on a loan?
No, I was going to say, the only reason that they did take the interest was they had to cover themselves that people were defaulting, so they had to make sure that they then had enough. Say if they lent out to 5 people, and only 3 of them paid back, so the interest on 3 of them would cover as if all 5 had paid back.
I'm inclined to think that that's a little too sanguine. It's a little too forgiving. A stronger reason is the fact that they were banned. Jews were banned from many of the professions. They were banned someplace for owning land. How are they going to earn a living?
But didn't people default on them as well?
Yeah, maybe so, but we're talking about people who weren't running a free loan society or running a loan society. I mean, they're wealthy people. It's one of the things they did. At any rate, let me ask you a question. Avis Rent-A-Car. What do? They have cars. They own cars, and they charge people for using their cars. Is that vicious? Somehow underhanded? Somehow morally corrupt? You go away for the summer and you have a house. And you rent your house for the summer. Anything morally wrong with renting out your house? Nothing wrong with renting out your house. Nothing wrong with renting out your cars. Why is there anything wrong with renting out your money? You're just renting out your money. You want to use my money, I can't use it. Just like you want to use my car and I can't use it. You want to use my house and I can't use it. Why shouldn't I charge you a fee for using my money? There is absolutely nothing wrong with charging money for the use of your money. Why then does the Torah prohibit taking interest on a loan to another Jew? Because, as Rav Hirsch says, In this case, and many other cases, because the Jewish people is a family. And if your brother asks you for a loan, then you don't take interest. As a business matter, you'll take interest. If your brother asks you for a loan, you don't take interest. And if you'll say, well then, how come a Jew can rent his car to another Jew and take money? Or you rent his house to another Jew and take money? The answer is, there has to be an economic system between Jews. They have to form an independent economic group. But there has to be one symptom of the fact that they're still a family. And the truth is, if you need a car and you don't have enough money for a car, then you can borrow money from me and get a car. If you need a house, you don't have enough, you can borrow money from me and get a house. So with the money, you can get the other things that you need. So here, the starting point is the false logic that something wrong with charging interest. Once you get to the point that charging interest is appropriate, so then you have to explain why you can't take it from the Jewish people. Once you understand that we are a family, you understand that this is not a question of justice, but it's a question of sensitivity to a family. And this is what Rav Hirsch says. Rav Hirsch says the requirements of justice apply between Jews and non-Jews. A Jew cannot treat a non-Jew unjustly. But the special obligation that you have for members of the family, that is built into the relationship between Jew and Jew and explains many of the laws that distinguish between how Jews treat Jews versus how Jews treat non-Jews. And by the way, that's built in the title of the nation. We are called Bnei Yisrael. Literally, Bnei Yisrael means the descendants of a man named Israel. That's to emphasize the fact that we are really a family. Okay? So don't ever be persuaded that your logic and understanding should go on holiday. That's not the Torah way.